So I'm going to talk about I believe, the fifth principle, which is know by trying. And I'm going to bring a bit of playfulness to this penultimate chat, and I'm going to give you an extended pasta metaphor for which I have no regrets. So what I want you to take away from today is that organisations, we can see them as complex systems, and there are different ways to know by trying, that is, to experiment, to prototype, to test organisational development. There's three different ways to do that if you think about organisations as complex spaghetti. So there's three different ways of interacting and testing within organisational development. So there's the pack approach, the strand approach, and the bowl approach. So yes, I did draw these illustrations myself. That's why they look so amazing. So a pack approach to organisational development. So the pack, it's orderly, right? It's really neat. It's contained. It's kind of straight lines, kind of dry, kind of inedible. This is how a lot of us historically have done organisational development. So we might create things that look like this, like a diagram, which sort of purports to tell us what the organisation is like now or could be like in the future. And this is the pack of spaghetti. This is quite dry. Ultimately, you can't really do anything with a pack of spaghetti, can you? You can't eat dry raw spaghetti, and this is kind of, you can't really do much with these sorts of diagrams either, because actually what they are, they're not really, well, the reason they exist, to be honest, is to do this. They're artifacts to soothe uncertainty, and I'll come back to talk about uncertainty a bit at the end. So they're not really developing our organisation, are they? They're a crutch that we historically have leaned upon, because the complex spaghetti is overwhelming, and we don't really, in the West anyway, don't really have any kind of ways of knowing about that. We're not very practiced about it. So if we don't want to take the pack approach, what can we do to develop and change our organisation? How can we address this complexity? So there's the strand approach, which I'm not going to go into today, but probably a lot of you will be familiar with it. It's kind of a classic user-centered design approach. So you might take one strand of that bowl of spaghetti, take it out, isolate it, look at it, do something with it. So you might take a process. It might be an appraisals process, or the way you do expenses in your organisation, and you might go, this doesn't really work at the moment, we're getting some bad feedback about it, and we're going to do some prototyping and user-centered design with people, and we're going to make this strand of our organisation better. We're going to do it kind of in an isolated way, and that's a really good way of experimenting. And if you go to We the Catalyst website, they've got loads of really great examples of charities that have taken this approach, and it's really good, it's really valid. But what I want to talk about today is the complex bowl of spaghetti, and how we start to probe, sense and respond into that. So Peter, I don't know if he's still here, but was part of this project. So I did some coaching and organisational change work with the Children's Society. This was about 2 years ago. And what I did, echoing Tessa's approach of holding space, I held a coaching space for the senior leadership team for 6 weeks. And we sent out lots of little probes into the organisation around some things we wanted to change and explore. We sensed what came back together. We did some collective sense making, and then we responded. We launched new probes and tested new things. And one of the things that the senior leadership team wanted to work on was, we want to improve our work-life balance. Now, we couldn't take that strand approach, because that's not a service. That's a relational, systemic issue in that team that is connected to the system of the organisation. How do you control your work-life balance when you're fielding requests and all sorts of stuff from the people you work with all the time? It's also connected to our societal systems. Childcare policies, that affects our individual and our team work-life balance. So you certainly couldn't draw a diagram like the pack, and you certainly couldn't isolate one strand and do a service design project on it. So we needed to take a bit more of a complexity-informed approach. And we did lots and lots of things. So we launched lots and lots of little probes. But I wanted to talk about one that was maybe the smallest thing we did, very little thought behind it actually, and it kind of changed the whole conversation. So before I get to that, this nice quote by Dave Snowden: "One can only really understand a complex system by interacting with it." So this is where we don't do a really big, long user-centered process. We just try some stuff. We probe, we sense, we respond. So I'll read this out in case you can't see it. So this was a little line that someone in the leadership team put at the bottom of their email. You probably all have something a bit like this now, but in 2019, early 2019, it wasn't as widespread. So it says, "My working hours may not be the same as yours. It suits me to send this email now, but I do not expect a response or action outside of your own working hours." So this was quite new at the time, certainly within the Children's Society. And this kind of, you can't really say it went viral anymore, can you? But it did. It really took off, and people started seeing it. There were loads of conversations around it. It opened up all these spaces to talk about the culture of the organisation and how people relate to each other and what's acceptable and what boundaries look like. People started just spontaneously taking this phrase, putting it in their own emails or Slacks or whatever, and sort of rephrasing it. It went outside the Children's Society, where collaborators and partners saw it and were like, "Oh, that's interesting. Like, can we have a conversation about that?" And so, on the one hand, it's a really simple, easy thing to do. So I don't want to overstate. When it comes to organisational development and change, this was a really small step that people could take. So that's probably one reason why it took off in the way that it did. But I also really believe that it was this small little probe was working at this really deep systemic layer, and I think it was something like the sort of emergent system or the emergent organizational system of the future, which was, relational, respectful, equitable, where people could set boundaries and have that be respected, where we talk openly about what our needs are, all these sorts of things. I felt like this little probe was like a sort of signal from that new emergent system to the existing dominant system. And I think that's partly why it took off in the way that it did. And when we're thinking about know by trying, by doing these little probes and sensing and responding, it's really about launching many safe to try prototypes. It's about, I think Tess might have mentioned an orchestra or a music, making music together. It's a bit like that. It's like a really big orchestra and symphony where, like in any complex system, you can't look at and unpack all the different relationships and interactions between all the instruments, but together they make this really beautiful sound. And that's what experimenting in complexity is a little bit like. Again, like Tess said and others have said, much more eloquently than me earlier today, it's your role in this as a leader or somebody who is leading change is to hold space in the unknowing and to support people through that uncertainty. And I would say that if you want to take this approach, if you don't want to do the pack, which I hope that you don't want to do, if the strand isn't going to cut it for everything and you want to work in that complex bowl of spaghetti, to investigate your own relationship with uncertainty. And this really goes to what a lot of the brilliant speakers have spoken to earlier. It's about understanding what's driving your own behaviour, what's in your past, what your relationship is to uncertainty and control. And I'll put a link in the chat in a minute, but there's all sorts of things that feed into that. You might be interested to understand and explore how white supremacy, for example, fits into patterns of control within organisations and how that can prevent us from sitting in that uncertainty and saying things like, we don't know, or let's explore, or let's hold those questions, to Teo's point, rather than rushing for the answer all the time. So so those are the three ways that you can sense into knowing by trying and experimenting in your organisation. And I really hope that you leave the pack behind and be more strand and be more bold.